Hi everyone, this is Alexander. Welcome to our second episode in the series Patchwork Empires, where I discuss how Greeks and non-Greeks are represented in video games in a Hellenistic context. This covers the period between the conquests of Alexander the Great in the 4th century until the Romans conquered the regions of his former empire. Today, I'll be covering Rome 2 Total War. Rome 2 was released in 2013, almost a decade after the first installment of the series. This game, like its predecessor, is a turn-based grand strategy game with real-time battle elements. Similarly to other Total War games, you focus on building up your cities, recruiting armies, and conquering your enemies. The focus of the video, like the previous one, will remain centered around the representation of non-Greeks in the armies you can build. The notions which I will cover are of good versus bad, stronger versus weaker, and aggressive versus defensive. They are tropes that are often seen in history as well as in historical games where the narrative revolves around binaries. Such binaries help us to reinforce people's existing ideas on various topics, but it is important to think on where these ideas come from and what they're based on. The game makes a clear distinction between the way the different factions are organized. The more Greek factions, they're well-rounded and have a larger focus on defense. Their well-armored and highly detailed units are Greek. They wear elaborate armors and are often an almost glorified image of these ancient soldiers. The lighter units, who are oftentimes locals, fight from range, wear no armor, and have little character. This is part of the binary bias which links hoplites with honor and light infantry with cowardice, which is something I will get to a little later in the video. The non-Greek factions, they're more aggressive and often have essentially no defensive units. They're attacking factions, aggressors, the barbarians so to speak. Their defensive units are sometimes just worse versions of the Greek ones. In the cases of these factions, the locals either very rarely wear armor or in most cases are just dressed in plain clothes. Following a similar pattern as with the first game, I will go over the different factions. First is the most eastern one, the Bactrians. Bactria was a Hellenistic kingdom located in modern-day Afghanistan. They were ruled by Greco-Macedonian kings, and the official language for a long time was the Greek Koine, which can be treated as the standard Greek language at the time. Their military was composed of phalanx infantry, a very large cavalry force which was made up of local Bactrians, who were renowned in antiquity, and with various light skirmishing units. The Bactrian kingdom did not feature in the first game, but is a Hellenistic kingdom, which in this game has a mixture of Greek and local units. Once again, the Greek units have elaborate armors and helmets, while their local counterparts are not wearing any protective gear. Almost all of their melee units are Greek, with only their ranged units having locals in them. I refer to Greeks in the terms of what the game considers Greek. Historically, we cannot consider the Greeks as a unified whole. Their archers are all local Persian units, which is also feeding on stereotypes from classical Athens that archers were cowards and fight like barbarians, and the hoplites were courageous warriors. In the game, this translates to the Greeks fighting as brave and heroic hoplites or phalanx, while the local barbarian Persians are only good for fighting as cowards. This is a viewpoint from around the 6th or 5th century BCE. It can be connected to the richer citizens of the Greek polis who fought as hoplites or cavalry, which was also seen as very masculine. Meanwhile, fighting from range was something that the poorer people did and was seen as cowardly and feminine, which is also how the Greeks described the Persians, who they saw as barbarians. While this is not how barbarians are often depicted today, it is still a retelling from an old prejudice. Aeschylus, for example, calls the Persian king Darius a king of archers and describes how he had to flee from the Greeks after a battle, while in the Iliad, Diomedes compares Paris to a girl because he's fighting with a bow. At least this time in the game, the archers do look a lot like the depictions that we have of them, unlike in the first one. Funnily enough, this prejudice against archers is ironic given the fact that in the 5th century BCE, the Athenians made extensive use of archers until they were too poor to maintain them. Then we have the Bactrian cavalry, who were famous for their prowess on the battlefield. In one battle at the Ares River, the Bactrians were able to field 10,000 of this cavalry according to Polybius. In the game, these units are seemingly made up of Greeks rather than the local people, who were the ones actually famous in antiquity. They have no hints of anything unique and instead look like a pretty standard Greek cavalry unit with barely if any cosmetic changes. Next is Parthia, which is a kingdom that we have discussed in the previous video. If you're not familiar with the Parthians, you can learn more about them there. The Parthian units are predominantly unarmored with the exception of the Persian hoplites who are wearing Greek armor. After their wars with the Greeks, the Persians adopted a lot of the Greek tactics and their heavier armor. They also oftentimes made use of Greek and Thracian mercenaries and commanders, but the armor that they used would still be locally produced and a variant of the Greek ones, not one-to-one copies of the white linothorax that the Greeks wore. A linothorax is a linen breastplate that was popular around the Mediterranean, and here you can see how it looked like. Instead of the developers giving these units more character, they simply dressed them up as Greeks and gave them no local character. In place of the overly represented painted shields of the phalanx, they are using plain, unpainted and battered shields to make them even more bland and unoriginal. They may not be wearing the fabulous pink pajamas from the first game, but the quite common skelmel that at least some of the Persian infantry would have access to is also missing from the game. They are either wearing white Greek armor or none at all, which is another way of total war separating the Greeks from the non-Greeks by again reinforcing the idea that the barbaric Persians did not wear any armor unless that armor was Greek, which is another way of total war separating the Greek from the non-Greek units by again reinforcing the idea that the barbaric Persians did not wear any armor unless that armor was Greek, because only the civilized Greeks can make armor. The Seleucids were also previously introduced and have much of the same issues as the Bactrians, but they do employ some armored local units, namely the previously discussed Persian hoplites, which are by the way a worse version of the Greek ones. The Greek ones also boast better stats. Next, we have Ptolemaic Egypt. The Ptolemies were one of the successors of Alexander the Great's empire, and were established by Ptolemy I and ruled Egypt until the death of Cleopatra VII. The Ptolemaic rulers adopted both the Egyptian title of pharaoh and the Greek basileus. They were portrayed in an Egyptian style and dress but maintained some Hellenistic traditions. Their administration was mixed and became much more Egyptian as time went on. Militarily, they used traditional Hellenistic armies of hoplites or phalanx and light infantry as well as cavalry, which was mixed between Greeks, Egyptians, and many others from the various territories they controlled. In time, the army became predominantly Egyptian. The Egyptians this time are at least not time travelers as we saw in Rome 1, but to show their distinct culture from the other Hellenistic states, the developers decided to have them wear crocodile heads and wear caps rather than actual helmets. Moreover, much of the local Egyptian units are wearing lighter armor compared to the Greek ones in the roster. Again, if we would look at actual depictions from antiquity, we can see that the Egyptians wore linothoraxes, bronze thoraxes, and actual helmets like the Phrygian one. In the game, they have lower stats than the Greeks because of course they do, and they never wear actual helmets. Interestingly enough, the unit cards do mention that the Egyptian army was made up of local units, not ethnically Greek soldiers. Unfortunately, an old prejudice of the Greeks being a distinct higher and better class than the locals in the Hellenistic kingdoms is reinforced in the game and is visually made obvious. While it would make sense to have some units of the Greek phalanx and the commanders being Greek, the rest of the army would not be so. The Egyptian soldiers were trained in the Hellenistic military traditions and had a variety of armor, mostly locally made because it would not make sense to import all armor. There would not really be that much difference between these units. Instead, we get worse versions of the Greek units, with their main difference being that they have makeup and worse stats, as well as lacking armor and helmets. The Kingdom of Pontus was introduced in the first video, and unfortunately they retained quite a bit of the pitfalls that their predecessors did. Pontus is rather lackluster and more or less suffers from the same issues as the other factions we have discussed, and has not much improved from its Rome 1 version. They employ Greek hoplite or phalanx units, and the good old naked Celtic warriors, unarmored Eastern units, and armored Pontic units. The so-called Pontic units, I will assume, was a creative way to include every other culture that was part of the Pontic kingdom and their armies, which is not a bad way to handle this. The Pontic Swordsman unit offers some form of variety and mixture by having different variants of the same armor on the soldiers, but it's the only one that does this. Unfortunately, immediately we can see a separation between the armored and disciplined Greek hoplites and the simply clothed Eastern units and the basically naked barbaric Celts. Nothing surprising really. At least, unlike in the previous game, their buildings do not look like they're in the middle of a desert. Finally, we have the Odrysians, which are the Thracians from the last game, just without the Getae part. The Odrysian dynasty was the most prominent of the Thracian royal dynasties, which ruled most of the Thracian lands until they were conquered by the Macedonians. After the split of Alexander the Great's empire, one of the successors was Lysimachus, who technically ruled Thrace, but the Odrysian king Seuthes III rebelled against him. At the start of the game, the Odrysians have lost their capital of Seutopolis, and we do not actually have any concrete records of what the situation in the region was. The Odrysians, unfortunately, unlike in the first game, are living in wooden huts on hilltops, while the Greeks live in stone houses in well-organized cities with actual streets and not dirt roads. They once again have a strange starting location, this time in the Greek colony of Odessos, which they did not control at all. Their roster has no phalanxes, except the Greek mercenaries. According to the others, the Odrysian army was made up of a mixture of infantry and cavalry. That infantry is likely to have included peltast and phalanx-style formations of heavier infantry. This was the most standard army composition at the time. Unfortunately, this is not well reflected in the game, as Thrace's roster lacks any defensive units and instead relies on a head-on, no armor, attack-heavy approach. At least there are no more naked Bastarnae, but the legacy of the Folksmen continues. The Thracian warriors are wearing no armor, with the exception of their elaborate helmets, and again are not able to form a formation. Only the nobility has access to armor and protection. Of course, not every soldier would have access to heavy armor chest piece, but at least some leather, a linothorax, scale, literally anything that offers some form of protection other than simple clothes. Except the nobility, the only other armored units are the Greek mercenaries. Because how do you separate your average Greek soldier from your average Thracian? Well, you give them armor, unlike those poor uncivilized barbarians in the north. The Thracians are shown as aggressive, unorganized attackers, with only their nobility being able to afford protection in comparison to the organized, well-armored and defensive-oriented Greek units. The aggressive, unarmored attacker versus a stoic, heavily armored defender is a way for the game to choose consciously to make a distinction between the two groups. Rome 2 reinforces stereotypes of the non-Greeks as weaker and as barbarians. They are unarmored, barbaric, aggressive, uncivilized, and weaker, while the Greeks are shown as orderly, defenders, more sophisticated, more advanced, and fairer. While there are some attempts in the game to break these binaries, in most places it still falls short. This brings us to the end of the video. I hope you have enjoyed watching it, and I will see you in the next one.